Hello, everyone. My name is Gianna Campa. I'm a co-founder of Blacklining, and I am a third-year student at Columbia. And I'm so grateful to have Tyler Campbell with me today for this interview. So, Tyler, please introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Tiana. I'm happy to be here. My name is Tyler Campbell. I am currently a senior at Columbia University. I am a writer, media maker, and organizer, originally from Philadelphia, but now, I'm based out of New York City.
Amazing. So, we're just going to jump right into the questions. So, what did growing up in Philadelphia mean to you?
Oh man, that's a tough one always because it's always hard for me to answer because it means so many different things for me. But I would say that it gave me my worldview, among other things. I think growing up in Philly, like, 5 blocks from people who was living really in, rough conditions, and then 5 blocks from people who were living in really, really good conditions gave me a sort of lens on inequality and, injustices across, a lot of different spaces just by, seeing and observing. And I think growing up, I didn't necessarily realize a lot of the things that I was experiencing and seeing because that's all I knew, but as I started to get older, started to go to other places, I began to realize just how important Philly was to me, how it shaped me. Because I realized, getting to New York, I realized a lot of places are different. But I think, Philly gave me my compassion, my drive, and I think my grittiness. I think when you come from a city like Philly, it's always um I don't know, this kind of unifying factor of like a really hard-nosed, hard-working kind of mentality, because it's not a place you could kind of be in and do any BS in, if you will.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Also, just curious, is the street behind you like part of Philadelphia?
Yeah, it is. It is. I don't know. When everything went virtual, it was really weird because I was, on all these places. And so I wanted to kind of, have a visual representation of somewhere that I'm always at. This is a block party on 59th Street in West Philly, where I was actually at this block party. This girl right here is one of my homies' little sisters. And I know some of the young boys right here playing basketball. So it's like a really personal kind of touch that I like to add to the virtualness, which is so impersonal.
Yeah, that is true. Also, that's such a nice picture. I had like no idea that you like knew everybody, so that's like even cooler. Um, who are you as a poet, and what is your mission?
I think, I don't know, I kind of became a poet by accident. I think, a lot of times I think poetry is a vehicle for expressing what you're kind of experiencing, what you're seeing. And I think that, the world itself made me a poet. It's not something that I set out to do in a lot of different ways, if that makes sense. And so I think my mission in terms of poetry is documentation. My poetry is a claim to existence. Like, what I'm saying? I'm always trying to say that, like, we are here, we exist. Because I feel like the reason why I gravitated towards poetry as a medium is because growing up, I realized a lot of the stories, experiences, people that were so important to me, like some of the people, in this picture right here, um, weren't being reflected back to me in a lot of the media I was consuming and the poetry I was consuming. Even, once I got to Columbia and I became, creative writing major, I'm doing the work, I'm doing the program, and I realized that not a lot of voices from people from my city, people from, the community that I grew up in, people who even are sharing stories that are, somewhat akin to my own. And so that's why I thought it was so important to kind of begin writing myself and, almost making a claim to existence. You know what I'm saying? Because I think once, I'm long gone, it's not about me, it's about the stories, right? It's always about the stories. I'm in constant pursuit of, telling stories and telling them from different viewpoints. And so that's why I think poetry has always been the medium for which I've been able to do that.
Yeah, like this claim to existence concept kind of goes into my next question, which is like, how do you combat monolithic views of perceptions of people in the inner cities?
I think the number one reason is allowing them to speak for themselves. That's a big proponent of not just my writing, but like a lot of the work that I do is allowing people to speak for themselves, right? I think no person, no matter how brilliant or gifted, can speak for an entire group of people. And I think there's this natural inclination that I think is going on now, especially with social media, as you handpick individuals with certain backgrounds, you know what I'm saying? And then all of a sudden they become the spokesperson, if you will, who's been not appointed by anybody, you know, on talking on all these different issues, and they're like quote unquote an expert. And it's like, you know, I can't even speak for, you know, just the people that I grew up with, some of my homies who I really know really well, let alone just, you know, people that I've never met before. And so I think it's all always about, as soon as you get a platform, seeing who doesn't have a voice and making sure that you can pass them the mic. I think one of the things that we say in the poetry community is, hey, just pass the mic, right? And so that's one of the kind of ethos of all I do is, you know, it's almost like an inversion of the seat at the table model, because the seat at the table is always about elitism and kind of excluding people and being in elite rooms. And so my method is more so trying to get a seat at the table so we can, you know, metaphorically speaking, smash that table. It's like a billion different pieces, and then reconstruct it and see who's not there and make sure all those voices are being invited and included, because otherwise, you know, what kind of conversation you're going to have if you're excluding folks. And so I think, you know, I've been blessed with a lot of different privileges and opportunities that a lot of folks where I'm from don't really have. And so my duty I view my duty rather as, you know, making sure that I can pass the mic and making sure that all those voices are elevated, because I know I can't speak for everyone.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds a lot like why we structure our website the way that we do, with like not only like academic writing pieces, quote unquote, you know, but we do poetry, we do videos, all that different type of stuff, because you truly can't represent anything with like one medium or person. So yeah, I completely agree. And like more people should be trying to pass the mic, you know?
Yeah, for sure, for sure,
Yeah.
for sure.
So tell me about your interview project. I know you said like incorporating other voices was like an integral part of your poetry project. So like, tell me more about like the interview process.
Okay, yeah. So I personally, one of the things that I love to do is I love to conduct interviews, whether I'm doing academic work, whether I'm doing, you know, journalism work, because I'm also a journalist, and whether I'm doing poetry work, I always find ways to try to conduct interviews. And so what I do is I like to do it like really personal. So even during the pandemic, I've been doing social distance interviews. And so the way I do it is I always start within my own network, right? So that means like my family, my friends, you know, people that I know. And I'm of this kind of belief that, you know, the degree of separation between people is so small, right? And so what I do is I'll, you know, begin by interviewing my homies, people I grew up with. And then after an interview, I'll ask them, I'll be like, yo, can you give me one or two people, you know, that you think I should interview? Whatever topic it might be, because they've already been through the interview now and they can think in their head, and so then they give me two people, and then I reach out to those two people, and then kind of by doing that a couple times, you know, at that point I've really expanded my network, and I've tapped into a bunch of different people that I might not have met, but I'm really closely associated with, you know, against like people that are like, you know, some of my homies' closest friends, siblings, you know, people they work with at their job. And so that way I'm now traversing a wide range of people, and then, you know, my interview subjects are that much more rich, right? And so I kind of do that, and I always like to offer space. And so I kind of conduct my interviews. I usually do about 2 or 3 for any given project per person. So that way, because I feel like, you know, the first interview can always be a little awkward, can kind of make you nervous. And so I like to really, you know, highlight, you know, not just what we're talking about. So if I'm doing an interview about, I don't know, or I'm currently working on a project that's looking at Philadelphia school students and how they've been impacted by gun violence, specifically looking at the Simon Grad School, which has had, I think, 36 current students and recent alumni who have been shot within the last year, which is really astounding. And so I was looking to kind of get into that school and talk with them about that experience. And so, you know, with a project like that, right, it's like not just asking them about the really basic stuff around gun violence, but also asking about their lived experiences, what things make them happy, what things bring them joy, you know, what they do for fun, trying to kind of create a more holistic picture of the individuals rather than just looking at, you know, whatever the interview overlying topic might be.
So tell me about your poetry project, Another Day in Paradise.
Okay, Another Day in Paradise. So that project is one of my newest projects. I'm actually gonna make that my senior thesis capstone for creative writing. And so I don't know, anytime I close a chapter of my life, I like to try to produce a work of creative work that kind of sums up that period. And so Another Day in Paradise is that work. The title for Another Day in Paradise is drawn from a graphic design on a hoodie by somebody I knew from growing up. His name is Shakar Johnson. he was tragically killed over the summer. He's a clothing designer, fashion designer from West Philly, and he was really big in the community, made really cool clothes. It was really always just a stand-up guy, honestly. And it was really sad that he was lost this summer, and he was actually killed at a block party cookout that he was hosting for the neighborhood as a kind of celebration for his clothing business, but also just to bring people together. So it was really sad that it ended like that. And he was a really great person. I was excited to see what he was going to do. And so I took the term Another Day in Paradise from one of his designs because I wanted to kind of pay tribute to him, but also to make the subject about, gun violence in Philadelphia and looking at how it's impacting, my community and the people that I'm really close to. And so what happened was it's probably one of the most deeply personal and really interconnected pieces that I've ever kind of worked on. It was really spontaneous. And so it began kind of with interviews because, poetry can often be viewed as like a singular kind of voice thing, like the poet is writing the words. And so I started out actually doing interviews with people that I knew who had been impacted by gun violence in some capacity, whether they've been shot at themselves, anything like that, or just being inside a neighborhood, because people I think underestimate how just living with the threat of daily gun violence can kind of impact how you live and how you move, and where blocks you go to, what time you're out at night. These are things that I think are like kind of second nature to people where I'm from, but I think it's a trauma response in a lot of ways. And so I began asking a series of interview questions to people, and then I drew quotes and stories and moments from those interviews, and I incorporated them into my poetry project, Another Day in Paradise, which encompasses some of my own experiences along with those of the individuals that I interviewed. And it's, I don't know, I think it's a really dope project. It's both visual as well. There's a set of pictures that I've taken of people that kind of go along with that, city neighborhoods, and also crime scenes as well, trying to paint a more holistic picture around gun violence. Because if gun violence has been a hot topic issue, not just in Philadelphia, but in a lot of urban cities, across America for the past, like I want to say year since the pandemic started, and they started to see a lot of different spikes. But one thing I noticed was that this conversation that are being had are very, as we kind of said earlier, very monolithic. And so my goal with this project was to bring much more humanity and much more real life experiences into, something as nuanced and complex as, gun violence.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear about that. And that's such a beautiful way to keep this story alive. So yeah, doing great things. Kind of pivoting to another topic, can you define Black aliveness and talk a bit how that concept influences your writing?
For sure. So Black aliveness is a term coined by scholar Kevin Koishi. I think he's currently at Dartmouth in the English department, and he's kind of an African-American theorist. And so Black aliveness is the idea that essentially, to put it simply, that Black people did not just live and die in subjugation and trauma and pain. And so he's kind of inverting this infatuation with, it's kind of an inversion of fascination with Black death. You look at like the Black Lives Matter movement and how all we're talking about is Black folks who have been, killed and losing their lives. But, you can't judge a person just by how they died or, the last moments that led up to their death, but rather choosing to center their life, their lived experiences, and kind to look at, these really traumatic moments from a different lens, right? And so what that can look like is, for example, like, we'll take Shakar, like, he was killed at a party that he was hosting, which is very tragic. It's something that, we can definitely talk about. But I think he also was someone who had real life contributions. He was doing really positive things in the community. And so it's choosing to look at things from a more nuanced lens, looking at the bad along with the good and centering, a more holistic picture of people's lives and experiences, which, as I kind of said, is the ethos of my work and why it's been very foundational in everything I've done thus far.
Yeah, that definitely helps combat like the kind of monolithic view of like tragedy and oppression. It's, there's so much joy, Black joy. Does that like kind of go along with that concept?
Yeah, I think it is related, but I think the problem that I see along with Black joy movement essentially is that Black joy also kind of has the tendency to kind of not look at, the effects of white supremacy. And so I think Black Aliveness is saying that while, yes, we can't, look at how white supremacy and anti-Blackness have manifested and created these living conditions, but I think even in the midst of all of that, there is such joy, like, cookouts and block parties, hanging out with your friends, going to church with your grandmama, like that plate of food that your mom makes for you when you come home and you visit, playing basketball at 5-on-5s to pick up, like those is like the real moments of, joy that I think are also inside of these communities. Cause I feel like, this kind of idea when you're from the outside looking into the, everything is bad and life is really hard and it sucks. And it's like, but we had a good time and there's a lot of beauty inside of these places. That's why, you look at like gentrification, like why do people want to come and live in these neighborhoods, and it's because, there is such a vibrant culture. There is such a huge thing that you can't emulate or copy and go anywhere else, and that's why I think it, it's both and rather than either or.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about gentrification?
Gentrification, oh man. I think that's a whole different topic in and of itself, but I mean, it's just, I don't know. So, I mean, you look at West Philly in particular and like University of Penn's relationship with West Philly and how it's kind of, really just continued to eat away at some very historically Black neighborhoods and communities. Like, I think people don't really understand. They think gentrification is just like when, new buildings pop up, you start to see a couple of Sweetgreens, a bunch of Starbucks, but really what it is erasing culture. It's erasing memories, right? So like playgrounds that I grew up on don't exist anymore. You know what I'm saying? Schools that people attended don't exist anymore. You know what I'm saying? Neighborhood staples, places that have been there for years aren't even there anymore now in places, just some modern looking building that, people can't even really enter. And it's like that to me is like one of those things like, can my kids come and see places that were instrumental in my upbringing? Those are like questions that I think are really, really important. And I think that's one of the understated impacts of gentrification. But then also I think when you kind of look at gentrification from a cultural standpoint, what happens too is you see people who are moving into neighborhoods who haven't been a part of those neighborhoods and those communities, and now all of a sudden they have different rules. And so then you see the rules and the customs in the neighborhood begin to change, right? For example, like if people every, Saturday evening like to play, music really loud and we have like neighborhood parties, they kind of get together, people drink, they have a good time, there's food, right? But then when you have people moving in from outside the community, what ends up happening is they don't like that. And so they start filing noise complaints. And then the police come, and the police start shutting down these parties and these kind of rituals that have existed inside of these communities for decades, And it's like, now that's just not a thing anymore. People like to, have parties in the local park areas and they start calling up the Parks and Rec company and they're saying, hey, you know what, you need a permit for this. And, you've never needed a permit for that up until this point. But now that these new people are in here, they're trying to have a different set of rules. And so now you see the community start to change and you start to think the values start to change with that. And I think that's the real tragic part of gentrification, aside from people also being pushed out from the neighborhoods, the people that make these communities special in the first place.
Yeah, that is so, like, it must be hard to like look back and see all these places, disappearing, before you. I can't even imagine.
Crazy. Like that's what happens every time I come home from Columbia, is different spots. Just like going. I'm like, I'm calling my mom, like, yo, mom, like when they put this here, like when does Target get there? Like, you looking up and there's all these different places. You like, yo, what? Like, there's this places that I've always taken for granted are just gone, and it's like, and there's just a few short years that I've been at Columbia, so many places have changed. And it's like, wow, it's just, it's heartbreaking for sure.
Yeah. So, pivoting away from gentrification, thank you for like your words on that. Very like illuminating and, offers like a great perspective on it. So I would love to hear the story of people reciting poetry amidst chaos of police violence at a protest that you were at.
Yeah, so I mean, after, George Floyd was killed, summer 2020, a lot of places erupted. Philly was one of those places where everyone was taken to the streets, it felt like. And of course, I was out there with everyone because I can't not be with the people in the community always. And so I was out there. One of the things that was most striking, because I mean, just first off, the response from the Philadelphia police was insane. Like they had like National Guard was there. They had like literally military tanks just posted on the block. Like I went to Wendy's with some of the homies just trying to get a 4 for 4, you know how we do. And when we went, it was just this huge military tank just there. And it was so like crazy for like military occupation for sure. But what happened was, you know, in the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of all these protests, there were folks literally circled around and they were reciting poems. And to me, that's one of the powers of poetry. People often look at you and go, well, what does poetry ever do to anything? Poetry doesn't really mean anything, right? And I think poetry definitely can't stop a bullet. Poetry can't, you know, ban legal chokeholds by police. Poetry's not going to free the homies who might be locked up in state prison. You know, poetry can't do any of those things, right? But poetry, I think, in a lot of ways, is the lifeblood and the energy of a movement. And I think an example of that is, you know, while we were at these protests, folks are, you know, could have been doing anything, right? But they were choosing to, like, you know, recite poems from, you know, Mary Baraka, Sonia Sanchez, Morgan Parker, and, you know, in reciting these poems, I think we were using those words as our safeguard. And I think it was such a serene moment that I was kind of witnessing amongst all this chaos. It was so crazy, but also really kind of helped shape, you know, a lot of my views and like confirm a lot of beliefs for me. So it was a dope experience. And it was very common. Like, you know, I've been to a lot of protests in my time now, you know, and just haven't seen all that. It's, you know, it's a very regular experience. And I think there's a reason for that always.
Yeah, I agree. Like poetry can't directly stop anything from happening, but it can bring people together in ways that like other forms of writing I don't think can. Just like expose like the human soul in a way that like other writing can't.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. One of my homies, my mentor, his name is Tango Isaac Martin. He always says that, you know, poetry is one of those key educational tools because, you know, it's the voice of the oppressed. Because, you know, to publish a long form, you know, nonfiction, fiction book, you have to have time, you have to have an editor, you have to have all these things. But, you know, you can write poetry on the bus on your way to work, you know, at 6 in the morning. You can write poetry in the break room at, you know, your job, you know, on a napkin. You know, you can write poetry very much in a very quick way. And that's why it's so much more accessible to, you know, working class folks, folks who got lives, folks who got things going on. Because I think writing especially was always historically, you know, looking back, you know, like the folks like Aristotle, it was founded upon wealthy class individuals having the time to kind of write and like write down their doctrine and their beliefs. And so it's always had this elitist exclusive behavior. But I think poetry is kind of the one genre that is like an exception to that in a lot of different ways. And I think about like, you know, a lot of the homies that are in prison right now can't participate in the protests, can't get on the phone and call, you know, state senators, can't, you know, show up to the town halls, can't, you know, do any of those things because they're currently incarcerated, right? But they can read the poems, you know, and these are ways that we can kind of bridge gaps and kind of keep a movement going, keep everyone on the same page, I think, which I think is really underrated.
Yeah, very true. And like, yeah, it makes me sad when people write off poetry because like truly like it can mean so much. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Um, Now going to kind of your work with the Justice Ambassadors Youth Council, what have you learned from the work with that organization?
So I guess just briefly to explain the Justice Ambassadors. So the Justice Ambassadors is a unique platform for New York City young people ages 18 to 24 who are formerly justice involved or formerly incarcerated to participate in an 8-week course with city officials. So in previous iterations of this course, we've had individuals from NYPD, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, the Department of Education, New York City, what is it called? NYCHA, which is the housing developments. All these individuals who are essentially governing the lives and creating the policies that impact, you know, the most vulnerable young people in these urban communities, are now all of a sudden in the room with the people whose policies are impacting them. And so what happens in these spaces now is it's a really discussion-based kind of course that allows for the really brilliant sharing of ideas. There hasn't ever been, at least to my knowledge, a kind of setting where individuals who've been directly impacted by the system can really voice their opinions to the people who are governing those systems. And so I think one of the things that I learned from that is conversation is the first thing. I think, you know, now, especially looking at, you know, cancel culture and clickbait and how everyone is kind of wants the real simple truth and wants everything to be so black and white. And like, if you say the wrong thing, you're immediately canceled. And I think one of the problems with that is now we don't have any open, honest conversations. And so one of the things that I learned as, the instructor and lead facilitator for the Justice Ambassadors is that, even though I'm supposed to be in some of like a teaching kind of role, I learned so much just by watching the conversations unfold in front of me, and people were, disagreeing, and it really got intense at times. But one of the things that I realized when we kind of came out of that experience was that, things are so much more nuanced than we would possibly believe. And I think that if we're not collaborating on trying to find solutions, then we can't possibly begin to make a change. And I think it's like so much of writing off the other side or looking at people as cogs in the system, which they very much might be. But I think that, we don't begin to have those conversations and really get the people in the rooms who have those experiences to voice those hard truths. And we can't even begin to, change the system at all, let alone, upend it.
That's like so interesting and not what I thought it would be. And I'm so like in awe that like these people like are able to come together and have like conversations, when, from like perspectives of like, social media and everything, like they're supposed to be enemies, and like, yeah, they may all be cogs in a system, but everyone is like an individual as well. So like, like you were saying before about like representing like every different person's perspective, like that's so important too.
Yeah, I think that's another thing that I learned from us. So one of the coolest stories we have from that class is we actually had a young man in the Justice Ambassadors who was in the course with the district attorney who actually, or the prosecutor who sent him to prison several years prior. Mm-hmm. And so that was a very intense dynamic, and we made the choice to partner them together, and have them really trying to, reach an understanding and talk about what that sentence and him going to prison did to him. And also like, the flaws within those systems. And those two individuals were able to kind of co-develop a policy proposal, which is actually now being implemented as we speak, which is really, really dope, right? And so I think, collaboration can breed really great results. And on top of that, right, if we're not having conversations, we can't have a change, right? It's impossible to do that. And I realized that, one of the hardest things I had to realize from this experience was that these systems are very, very corrupt, but they're also corrupt within beyond understanding, right? Because I think like, being in a room with high up officials, you get to understand how, institutions like the New York Police Department work. And so one of the things that I learned is actually one of the most diverse police departments in the country in terms of its ranks. It's majority of people of color, majority of people who are from low income urban communities. Majority of these people, are actually from the very communities which they're policing in and have those lived experiences of the people that they're now arresting, which is very, very interesting. Because I think there's this perception that, police are, just white people who might be from the suburbs and are like very racist. And not to say that the police aren't racist, because, I really believe they is. But one of the things that's interesting is that, it's not as simple as, oh, we need to get them racial bias training. Oh, we need to, kind of look at how they do stop and frisk, because the NYPD has all these things in place, which is why I think abolition is the only route we can go, because it's a cultural problem, not a systemic one. Well, and a systemic.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I had no idea that the NYPD was so diverse, and yeah, it goes
on paper they're doing everything right, but yet we still see all these injustices coming out, and so it's like, how the hell is this happening?
Yeah, because it's a system.
It's like it's meant to be that way, and that's why even if they pass all the checks, they do all the right things, it's like, it's still going to come out and it's still going to destroy our communities, because that's unfortunately what it was meant to do always.
Yeah. So how do you think youth advocacy can help end the school to prison pipeline?
It's like I said earlier, just trying to empower the people who are directly inside of these experiences to then begin to speak out against them. I think it's one thing for somebody to speak out about something that they've read about, something that they've heard about, you know what I'm saying? But these are really trying to empower the young people who are currently in those systems, right? And currently, walking through those metal detectors and currently seeing those law enforcement officers and those police dogs in the lobbies of their schools, right? And I think that that's so important. And I also think, right, we have to arm them with the education of what they're really facing. I
Mm.
think is criminal to me that, for example, like at a place like Columbia University, we could sit and theorize all day about the evils of the school to prison pipeline, and just like 5 blocks away at PS, 109, those kids who are actively inside the school to prison pipeline and being made victim to these exact same things we're talking about every single day have no knowledge of it, and there's not being any conversation, there's not being an education process about, hey, this is what you're going on, this is how the system is set up to impact you, right? And so to me, that's why youth advocacy is number one. You got to tell these kids what they're dealing with, right? I think there's this tendency to think the kids can't handle certain information or the kids aren't ready for certain things. And I think that like that leads to like a lot of adults lying to kids, man. As someone who is in youth services and talking to young people all the time, man, I'm not in the business of lying to kids. I can't do that. So I'm always about telling them the truth when it's hard, when it's, something that's really tough to hear, but that's what they need to do because those are the people that are going to make the changes. And that's why we always like to empower them like that. Because otherwise, man, who we have making these decisions,
Yeah. And like as a psychologist myself, and well, aspiring psychologist, I know that like kids are very resilient and like to learning new things, like, even though they may be dark, if they have like the correct guidance and like it's not stated in a way that's like awful, that they can handle a lot of things and they deserve to know a lot of things because it actually can help them like develop and grow and like form like healthy mindsets in the future instead of like internalizing, things that, messages that they may be inferior from like white supremacy. If they know what they're up against, then they'll internalize that way less, it's
Sure,
so
exactly.
important.
You
Yeah.
hit it right in the head. Yeah, exactly. That's 100% a fact.
All right, well, that is all the questions I have. I feel like I could learn like so much, for hours, but yeah, that was all the questions I have. And thank you so much for talking with me, and being on Blacklining. And like, I hope that so many people can hear what you have to say. So
Thank you. It's been an honor. I'm just sharing space with you, even virtually like this has been a really dope experience. And I'm, perpetually in all of the work that you and everyone at Blacklighting is doing. And I'm really glad to be a part of it. Thank you so much.
all right. All right. Bye, buddy.